welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. Colonel Ty Newton of College Station spent 10 of his 30 years in the Air Force teaching and flying at the Air Force Academy. That was in 2 tours, divided by a tour of Viet Nam, where he flew C-130s. His love for teaching and flying laid the path of his military career that might have otherwise been a pro baseball career. It's a pleasure to introduce Colonel Ty Newton and to welcome him to Veterans of the Valley. Indeed, Ty, welcome to Veterans of the Valley. Let's talk about your career, 30 years in the Air Force, but before that, you were born in Hickory, Tennessee, home of Andrew Jackson, I understand. I want to talk about the baseball end of it because you were a baseball player. You went to Baylor on a baseball scholarship.
That's right.
Sort of talk about that part of your early career and then how that became a decision rather to go into the military.
Okay, going back to high school, I was in Rising, Arkansas, which is about 65 miles south of Little Rock, and played football, basketball, ran track. They didn't have a baseball team, but we played baseball out in the field during the summer. And between my junior and senior year in high school, I went away for the summer to play American Legion ball in Camden, Arkansas. We had a pretty good team, went to the state championships and did quite well. And then after graduating from high school, I went to Louisiana and played semi-pro ball down there. And they had some scouts there, and apparently one of the scouts knew the Baylor head baseball coach, and he came over to see us play in the playoffs and offered me a 4-year scholarship.
Wow.
This is in August before school started in September.
Right.
So I was pretty fortunate. So I entered Baylor in the fall of 1949, had 4 wonderful years there, played ball, and in the summer we played out at Alpine, Texas, a chance to get to play during the summer months, and we had a team made up of mostly Southwest Conference players, but some other schools also. And that's where I met my good friend Tom Chandler and his wife Willadine, and we remained good friends all of those years. And we had a good team. We won the state championship in semi-pro ball a couple of years and went to the national championships in Wichita, Kansas. And we also had a chance to play some pretty good teams that included some major league players during the Viet Nam War. They were drafted, the Korean War, they were drafted. And so,
who were some of those?
Bob Turley, who pitched for the Yankees, Bobby Brown, who played third base for the Yankees, a little later Don Newcomb, who pitched for the Dodgers. So for an 18-year-old kid, that was quite an experience to get a chance to do that.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, you went on, you got a chance to play in the Chicago Cub organization, played in Macon, Georgia, is that right?
Macon, Georgia, yes.
Yeah, and you met up with some pretty good ball players there too.
Met up with a young fellow that had a fairly good career named Hank Aaron.
Yeah.
And he played in that league as a second baseman for Jacksonville.
Right.
And went on to the Braves and the next year, in fact, and then played in the outfield.
Right.
And after that, I went back to Baylor to work on my master's, excuse me, to work on my master's the next fall. And my wife and I got married that winter. She was teaching school at Marlin, teaching physical education. And the next spring, I got my contract from the Cub organization. And about the same time, I got a little letter from the Air Force saying, welcome aboard, we'd like to have you. And I had gone through ROTC, but I had what they call a delayed deferment because the Korean War had ended and they weren't needing as many people then, so I didn't think I'd ever go in.
Right.
So I didn't go to summer camp or anything, but when I got these orders, I had to then go to summer camp and get ready to go into the Air Force.
Right.
So I did that, came back to school the next fall and completed my master's, and then went into the Air Force the next June of 1955.
In 1955, and you knew from the beginning that you wanted to fly, right?
Yes, I was pilot qualified and I didn't have any choice. They said, you go to pilot training.
Right.
I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I loved it. I really enjoyed flying. Went to Hondo, Texas, flew the T-6 there, and then went from there on out to Lubbock, where I flew the B-25 and enjoyed that. And I was supposed to stay there and be an instructor pilot. I found out that 6 months later they were going to transition into jets and no longer have the B-25s. And since I graduated high enough in the class to get my first choice, I decided to go somewhere else, because I wanted to stay in multi-engines.
Indeed. You went to Waco as a first assignment as an instructor pilot, and then when your hitch was up, you had a decision to make, whether you were going to stay military or go back and try baseball. Sort of talk about what you and Ruth decided and talked about and did.
Well, we decided, talked about the pros and cons. We knew pretty much what the military had to offer. There was some security. You weren't going to get rich, but you weren't going to starve, and you had your health benefits. And also, we talked about the possibility of war. We knew that was a possibility, and if we decided to stay, that was part of it, and we'd do it. So we knew that baseball was an iffy thing, and I enjoyed flying so much. And about that same time, I got an offer to go teach at the Air Force Academy, and that helped make the decision. So we decided to stay.
Talk about the Air Force Academy. Like we said, you spent 10 of your 30-year career at the Air Force Academy. Obviously, this is an institution that's very important to you. You had a chance to go there in your first tour, and sort of what you did there.
I went there as a first lieutenant teaching physiology, and that was the early days of the Air Force Academy. They still had leaks in the buildings. We had garbage cans sitting around catching the water. The framework of the chapel, which people know probably more than anything else, the chapel was just a frame then. We didn't have the aluminum on the spires or anything. So we got there early on, but we had a wonderful tour. It was a great family place because the facilities were great, and they had elementary and high school right there on the academy site. So, in fact, 2 of our kids started the first grade there and graduated from high school at the Air Force Academy.
Wow.
And as we got toward the end of that tour, 5 years worth, things were heating up in Viet Nam. So I volunteered for a flying assignment, and they put us in C-130s, and I think we had the best of all worlds because we got transferred to Okinawa, so the entire family got to go. We had 3 children at this time. First one was born when we were at Hondo, the second one at Waco, and the third one while we were at the Air Force Academy. So we all packed up and headed for Okinawa, and the family lived on Okinawa while I was flying every month down in Vietnam.
I want to back up a second back to when you were at Waco. Towards the end of that tour in 1959, you said you had a chance to fly a distinguished gentleman around Texas for a little while. Talk about that.
Yeah, that was quite an adventure. I was a first lieutenant, and the operations officer came in one day and said, would you like to take a VIP around on a speaking tour? And I said, well, yeah, I'd be glad to. Who is it? Said, it's Lyndon Johnson. So we went out to the plane, and here came this was before he became vice president, the year before he became vice president. But Lyndon Johnson, his wife, his secretary, and 2 or 3 other people, I guess publicity people, were there. And we took off and flew around East and North Texas, and he made little speeches here and there. And we came back and landed at Austin and let him out. He wanted to go to his ranch, but the weather was so bad we couldn't get in there.
Right.
So we had to land in Austin, and he wasn't too happy about that.
Yeah, I understand that he was a demanding person, and of course an aggressive personality, like a lot of people remember him, and I guess you remember him that way also.
That's
right?
exactly right. He was kind of crude and wasn't too respectful of people, as I recall.
Right, right. But it's still something that you certainly remember as he became President of the United States. Summer of 1960, you did go to the Air Force Academy, and like you said, it was a wonderful assignment because you got to have your family there, and you taught chemistry and physiology. Is that right?
Physiology. It was in the chemistry and physiology department. They were combined at that time. And we offered some other courses. All the cadets had to take physiology. We offered a few other courses to prepare those who wanted to go to medical school, the background so they could go. It was not a full-fledged pre-med program at this time, but some of the people took those courses and on their own got into medical school and went through medical school and then back to the Air Force.
Right. But you never got to stop flying, and I thought this was interesting. You went on to Vietnam, and then you came back to the Air Force Academy. We'll get back to Vietnam in a minute. But I believe in your second tour of the Air Force Academy, when you were teaching there, you got to fly, and you even flew med students around to their interviews at medical schools.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
We got to, we had to get our flying time, and this was one way of doing it. The cadets needed to go for their medical interviews, and we had one particular place where we took a lot of cadets, and that was down at Tulane. Dr. Jim Knight was the Dean of Admissions down there, and he really liked the cadets because they had such a wonderful background academically. They had no trouble in medical school, and he said, I'll take all you can give us. So we got to know him quite well, and that played a role in coming to A&M, really,
Sure.
because my good friend Bill Ward was in the department there, and he stayed at the academy while I was in Vietnam, and we got to know Jim Knight on the second tour, not the first tour.
Right.
And we'll get to that after Vietnam.
C-130, very versatile airplane, a very important airplane, not only to the Vietnam War, but it's still being used today
It is.
in Iraq. Talk about the C-130 and what you liked about it.
Well, it was a versatile plane, as you say. Not only carried supplies, but it carried troops, and they jumped out of the 130 parachuting, and it also served as a flare drop plane. We would drop flares on targets in Vietnam, and the fighter strikes would come in and wipe out the target. Also, we had some that were equipped as gunships, and they were the old AC-130s that had a 105 millimeter cannon in the back, a howitzer, a 40 millimeter cannon, a 20 millimeter minigun, and a 7.2 millimeter gun. And when you got all those firing at the same time, it put down quite a layer of fire.
Right. You are a member of a group here locally called the BSA, the Been Shot At group. Talk a little bit more about Vietnam and some of the adventures, I guess, as it were, that obviously it got pretty exciting, if that's the right word, from time to time.
It did, but I had it so much better than a lot of the other people. As I've mentioned, the people down on the ground in the jungles and the people flying helicopters and the people flying over Hanoi every day had it a lot worse than we did. But we had some exciting experiences. I flew just the plain old troop carrier supply plane, C-130, for the first year over there. And then our ops officer came around one day and said, would you like to start flying some special classified missions? And I said, well, tell me a little about it. What does this entail? And he said, I can't tell you until you volunteer to do it and sign some papers. And so I thought about that a little bit, and I said, well, okay, let's give it a shot. So after we went through the preliminaries, the first thing he said, your first job is to go into Laos with a little roller and measure all of the airstrips over there, and that's using the term pretty loosely because they were just dirt places that people, the Air America was flying in there, but they were going in small planes. But they wanted to see if we could get in there with the bigger planes. So two other guys and I went over and marked off all the airfields, took pictures, and found out which ones we thought we could make it in safely and out of safely. And so that started it. And then we found out that we would be flying in civilian clothes and flying unmarked silver airplanes instead of the camouflaged Air Force planes that we'd been flying. So it turned into something quite different from what we've been flying before. In the late 50s and the early 60s, Laos was about to lose its neutrality. The North Vietnamese were in there being supplied by the Russians. We had some Americans in there trying to keep things balanced out a little bit. And at the same time, there was a peace agreement, accord going on in Geneva, Switzerland. Averell Harriman was the lead negotiator for us over there, and it was between the Russians and the Chinese and the Laotians and the Vietnamese and Thailand, all the countries involved. And so they finally reached a settlement in 1962, and the settlement said that Savannah Phuma, who was a neutralist, would be head of Laos, and his cabinet would be made up of the three factions, the communists, the neutralists, and the royalists. And that was kind of a recipe for failure to start with, but at least it was a try. And they also said all military troops had to leave.
Right.
Well, we took our 600 or 700 military troops out of there. The North Vietnamese took 50 of their troops out through the checkpoint, leaving 5,000 to 7,000 still in Laos. So that presented a problem.
Right.
How to neutralize that, and the way we did it was through flying civilians and civilian planes in there, trying to supply and train the Laotians to combat these North Vietnamese troops.
So if they weren't going to play by the rules, we weren't
That's
going
right.
to play by the rules, but we were going to do it more undercover.
That's right. The Russians knew what we were doing. We knew what they were doing.
Right.
Neither one wanted to squeal on the other because we were both breaking the rules.
Right.
And so we just winked and kept doing it.
Indeed. Well, let's go to some photographs. We've got just a few pictures that you've supplied to us. Also a picture of that C-130, and I want to go ahead and go to those now and have you comment on them. Here's a young Ty Newton. When was this taken?
Oh, this was in 1955 when I was in pre-flight training down at Lackland Air Force Base before starting pilot training.
There you go.
I hardly recognize that guy.
Good-looking soldier there. Indeed. This next photograph, this is a photograph that I found on the internet, actually, of the C-130. That's quite a bird.
Yeah, it is. And the one that we were flying as the gunship had the guns out the left side that you see there, and it flew in a circular orbit around the target and fired everything into the target area.
Wow. Great airplane. And like we said, it's still being used today. We haven't talked about this yet, but later in your military career, you actually spent some time in England, just about 85 miles from London. And this is a picture that's taken then. That's you down the bottom left, standing at the base of the steps. And who's that VIP you're greeting there?
Well, that fellow is Prince Charles. He came up to Milton Hall one day to dedicate the stained glass windows in the chapel, and my wife and I and some others had a chance to visit with him in small groups, 10 or 15 minutes at a time, and then he came onto our plane and we gave him a briefing about the mission that we were flying over there.
So this was in the 1980s, is that right?
That's right, in the early 1980s.
Early 1980s. So he's about in his early 30s then,
I think so.
This is your family, who we'll talk about later, but why don't you tell us who those folks are?
Yeah, this was on my day of retirement in San Antonio. This was out in front of our house. On the right there's our oldest son, Mike, and his wife, Debbie. And behind Debbie is Kathy, which is our youngest son, who's standing just to the left of me there, Gary. And then that's my wife, Ruth, there. And then our daughter, Shay, and her husband, Mike. And they live in Austin. And Gary and Kathy live in San Antonio. And Mike and Debbie live here in College Station.
So that picture's a little over 20 years old, though,
that's right?
Because you retired in 1985.
That was made in August of 1985.
Right. Great pictures. November of 75, 10 years before you retired, you received an assignment to Thailand as a squadron commander. That didn't last very long, but talk about that.
No, it didn't. I had been at the academy for 5 years again on my second tour, and I was ready to get back into the cockpit, so requested flying, and they put me into the new 130 gunship, which is an H model, all computerized, really a wonderful plane to fly. And I went through 2 months of training to go back into that. Got over to Korat, Thailand in November of 1975. About 2 weeks later, they announced the closing of the base that was going to occur about 6 months later. And so we were wondering what in the world we were going to do there for the next few months, besides play tennis and a few things like that. And then about 2 weeks after that, I got a promotion to colonel, and that was a lieutenant colonel's job there. So they said, you can't stay here. So
you're overqualified.
So that's right. So after about 6 weeks, I was back in there, 2 months, I was back in the States. And I was sent to San Antonio to be a division chief of a research job down there at Brooks Air Force Base.
Right. And then you got an assignment that I know you and your family really enjoyed, going to Mildenhall, England, which is about 65 miles from London. Talk about what your job was there and what you did.
That was a wonderful assignment. It was a job, a joint service job. We had the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force there. And I was the Air Force Battle Staff Commander on the European Airborne Command Post. And we had a team, a battle staff team on alert, or airborne 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because things were still hot between us and the Russians. The Cold War was still going, of course. And so we were on alert and flying in order to disseminate orders from the President of the United States in case of a nuclear attack. Right. So if the headquarters were knocked out someplace, or if the President was disabled, we had alternative means of getting orders also. So we were there to disseminate those orders to the NATO troops or whoever needed the information. And we got to meet some wonderful people there, got to meet some good civilians in England that we still maintain contact with. They come to visit us every couple of years, and we go over there and visit them. And so it's been a wonderful experience.
That's wonderful. You spent 3 years there, then back to San Antonio. You retired on a Friday, I guess, in 1985, and the next Monday you went to work for your new job at Texas A&M.
That's right.
Talk about your service to A&M for 11 years.
I retired all weekend.
Right.
Went to A&M, and again, that was a result of our connections previously. Bill Ward, who had been at the Air Force Academy, went to work for Jim Knight, who was the first dean of the medical school at Texas A&M. And so he retired after 20 years, and I spent another 10 years, and he said, well, we probably have a job for you when you retire from the Air Force, and sure enough they did. So I went to work in Office of Student Affairs and Admissions at the medical school, Director of Student Financial Aid initially, and worked there for 11 years and got to do some of the things that we'd been doing at the Air Force Academy, dealing with medical students this time instead of pre-med students.
Right.
But we also got to go around to all the schools here in Texas and brief them about the medical school program, talking to the pre-med students. So that was a fun job, and we've enjoyed living here in this area because we had friends here before we came here, and of course now we have many more. And we've been here longer than we've ever been any place, so I guess our roots are pretty well established here.
You and your wife Ruth have been married for 53 years, and I know you have 3 children and 6 grandkids. Talk about your children, where they are, who they are. Yeah. Let you brag on your family son.
All right. Well, we were married, as I mentioned before, when I was still at Baylor working on my master's degree, and she was teaching school, and we had our kids on the first 3 assignments that we had. And they got to follow us around, and when we were in the Far East on Okinawa, one of the things that they got to do that most people don't get to do, they got to fly on military aircraft since it was called an isolated assignment.
Right.
So when I'd come back and we'd take leave, we'd all hop on a plane and head to Bangkok or the Philippines or Japan or Hong Kong or someplace. And so, in fact, Ruth got to land in Saigon. We were flying on a plane to Bangkok one time, and the plane landed in Saigon during the middle of the war.
Oh my goodness.
Fighters taking off and everything. We landed, refueled, and took off. And so after we got left the Air Force Academy then and went to San Antonio, Mike, our oldest son, had gone to Baylor one year. Then he came to A&M, so he was in Texas. Our daughter then went to Baylor and finished up there, and our youngest son went through tech school at Waco.
Right.
And so they all remained in Texas. We thought they thought they were Coloradans before we came down here, but they all ended up staying in Texas. Our oldest son is here with our oldest grandson. Our daughter lives in Austin, and she has a daughter and 2 children, right. 2 sons.
Now you mentioned your son Mike's name. What's your daughter and your other son's name? Don't want to.
Shay is the one in Austin.
Don't want to get you in trouble.
Okay. Shay is the one in Austin, She has her oldest daughter is a freshman at University of Texas this year, and she has 2 sons there. One of them's Sam is a junior in high school, and Ben is in the 6th grade.
Right.
And he's 12 years old. And then Gary and his wife Kathy live in San Antonio, and their children are Meg, who's 12, and Colette, will be 7 next month.
You're doing good. I think we got all 6 grandkids in there too.
Yeah, and we enjoy seeing them. In fact, we went this past weekend to Austin. We've been doing the Capital 10K for the last 20 some odd years, kind of as a family. We look forward to that. Some of us used to run it. We now walk it, but some of them still run it.
Well, that's better. I mean, most families get together and just, have a bucket of fried chicken, but at least you all get together and do something healthy. You all get together and run.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. You still have Air Force Academy reunion every couple of years, too. I know that's important.
Every 2 years, we get together someplace. And this coming summer, we're going to have it back at the Air Force Academy. We do it there about over 4 or 5 years. And 2 years ago, we met at Annapolis for the Annapolis Air Force football game, and had our reunion there. So we get together and renew our acquaintance, and our numbers are getting a little smaller, but still most of the people come. And the gentleman that was our department head back then, he's in his mid to high 80s now, and still very active. He was a real sportsman, and he played halfback on the Missouri football team. And I'll never forget when I went to the Air Force Academy for my interview. He was the one that interviewed me, and I don't remember him asking me anything about my academic background. But he asked me what my bowling average was, if I played squash, and if I played golf.
Ty Newton, we're out of time, but thank you. It's been a pleasure having you here, and thank you for your service. Colonel Ty Newton counts himself fortunate to have spent 3 decades serving our country and being able to share much of that service with his family in such faraway assignments. We thank him for his service. And we'll see you next time on Veterans of the Valley.